Welcome back for another deep dive. Today we are diving into how your senses, specifically hearing and vision, evolve.
All right.
We'll be using chapter 5 from this book on brain evolution as our guide.
Sounds good.
And it's really incredible to think how these senses went from, simple detection to actually shaping how we experience the world.
Yeah, that's right. It's not just about seeing or hearing. It's about our brains making sense of it all.
Yeah,
even creating illusions along the way.
So let's rewind way back, long before eyes and ears.
Okay.
Life was a very different sensory experience. What was it like back then?
So picture this: early organisms lived in a world dominated by smell and touch.
Okay.
And, those senses give you immediate local information, but they're very limited.
It's like being trapped in a tiny bubble, like right here, right now.
Yeah.
Is there an example of that in the book?
Yeah, there is. So think about C. elegans, this tiny roundworm.
Okay.
It navigates a chemical landscape using smell and touch.
Okay.
But it only knows what it physically bumps into.
So hearing and vision really broadened those horizons.
Absolutely. They allowed organisms to sense disturbances in the environment.
Okay.
So, vibrations in the air or water for hearing and then light for vision.
Mm-hmm.
So suddenly they could detect things at a distance.
Right.
Huge advantage for survival.
That makes a lot of sense, but the evolution of eyes especially just seems mind-boggling.
Yeah.
Even Darwin struggled with how something so complex could have developed.
Yeah, it's incredible. But think about it this way.
Okay.
Even simple light-sensitive cells would be a benefit,
Okay.
giving an organism a basic sense of light and shadow, like a rudimentary threat detector.
That's interesting. So instead of seeing like we do,
Yeah.
those early creatures might have just felt a change in light,
Right.
maybe enough to trigger an escape response.
Exactly. And over vast stretches of time, these light-sensitive clusters gradually evolved into more complex eyes.
Okay.
What's even more compelling is the variety of eye designs across different species.
Right.
It points to a common ancestor, a basic eye that was tweaked and refined over millions of years.
Like evolution working with a successful blueprint,
Yeah.
adapting it to different needs. The book even mentions the genetic evidence that backs up this idea.
Yes, the genetic evidence is fascinating.
Yeah.
It really highlights the power of evolution to build upon existing structures and mold them to different environments.
So let's go back to this early warning system idea. How did those first eyes, even simple ones, actually help creatures survive?
So imagine a creature with even a single eye.
Okay.
It could detect a looming shadow, which would trigger a quick getaway.
Okay.
Two eyes, of course, would give it directional information,
Right.
allowing it to move away from danger more effectively.
So vision was tightly linked to action even in those early stages. It
Yeah.
wasn't about understanding the world in detail. It was about reacting quickly to threats.
Exactly. The book mentions a fascinating example, the lamprey,
Okay.
which is a jawless fish. Researchers can stimulate specific parts of its brain and trigger specific movements. So turning, swimming, even approaching.
Yeah.
All based on visual input.
That's almost like a hardwired map of actions based on what the creature sees.
Yeah.
I'm curious, is there any learning involved, or is it purely instinctual?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And the answer is complex.
Okay.
There's definitely a strong element of instinct.
Right.
Shaped by natural selection.
Mm-hmm.
Those lampreys with the right visual motor connections were more likely to survive
Right.
and pass on their genes.
Yeah.
But even lampreys show some capacity for learning.
Okay.
So that's not a simple either situation.
That makes sense. Survival of the fittest with a dash of adaptability thrown in.
Right.
But things got even more complex when life moved from water to land, right?
Yes.
That must have been a game changer for vision.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This transition brought new challenges and opportunities.
Okay.
Think about early reptiles and mammals.
Okay.
They needed sharper vision to navigate this new terrain.
So did this move to land push the development of more complex eyes?
It certainly played a role. Remember, warm-blooded mammals
Okay.
need a lot of energy,
Right.
which means they need to be efficient hunters.
Mm-hmm.
And that, in turn, demands more sophisticated vision. It's fascinating how each evolutionary development seems to push the others forward.
It's like a chain reaction.
Yeah.
But even with these more advanced eyes, there's a lot more to vision than just capturing an image like a camera isn't there.
You're right. Seeing isn't just about detecting light. It's about processing and interpreting that light,
Okay.
turning it into meaningful information. And a lot of that processing actually starts in the retina itself.
Hold on, the retina.
Yeah.
I thought that was just the light-sensitive part at the back of the eye.
It is light sensitive, But it's so much more than that.
Okay.
Think of the retina as a multi-layered processor, not just a simple sensor.
Okay, that's not what I expected. Could you break that down a little more?
Sure.
What's going on in there?
Well, you have the photoreceptor, tells the rods and cones that capture the light.
Okay.
But then you have other layers of cells that start making sense of that light.
So it's not just recording light, it's already analyzing it.
Exactly. There are cells called bipolar cells
Okay.
that compare signals from multiple photoreceptors.
Okay.
And then there are retinal ganglion cells,
Uh-huh.
or RGCs,
Okay.
that get input from multiple bipolar cells.
Wow, so it's a whole network of processing before the signal even leaves the eye.
Right, and these RGCs are really doing some heavy lifting.
Okay.
Each one responds most strongly when there's a contrast in light intensity.
Mm-hmm.
So they're already highlighting edges and boundaries.
It sounds like the retina is picking out the most important features of the scene.
Precisely. And remember, there are different types of RGCs, each tuned to specific features.
Okay.
Some detect color contrasts, others detect motion.
It's like a team of specialized detectives, each looking for specific clues in the visual scene.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And this pre-processing is remarkably efficient.
How?
We have about 125 million rods and cones.
Right. But only about 1.2 million RGCs.
So the retina is doing a lot of data compression before sending information to the brain.
Right.
That makes sense. Why send all that raw data when you can just send the highlights?
Exactly. The retina is extracting the most ecologically relevant information.
Okay.
The things that matter most for survival and navigation.
Okay, so the retina is this amazing preprocessor.
Yeah.
But what happens next?
Right.
Where does that signal go once it leaves the eye?
That's where things get even more interesting.
Okay.
The signal travels to the brain,
Okay.
specifically to an area called the thalamus.
The thalamus, I remember reading about that in the book. It's like a relay station deep inside the brain, right?
Yes, it's often described as a relay station.
Okay.
But it's doing more than just passing along the signal. It's filtering and compressing the data,
Okay.
making sure the brain gets the most important information.
It's like a gatekeeper deciding what gets through to the higher levels of process. A great analogy. And from the thalamus, the signal goes to the primary visual cortex,
Okay.
or V1 for short,
Okay.
located at the very back of your brain.
V1, is that where the brain creates a map of the visual world?
Precisely. Neighboring cells in the retina project to neighboring cells in V1.
Okay.
So the spatial relationships of the scene are preserved.
So it's like a point-to-point representation of what the eye sees.
Yes, but there's more to it than that. V1 actually contains multiple maps
Oh.
representing different aspects of the visual input.
Okay.
Form, motion, color.
Wait, so it's like having multiple layers of a map,
Yeah.
each highlighting different features?
Exactly. And what's really remarkable is that V1 doesn't just passively receive this information.
Okay.
It starts extracting higher order features from the raw data.
Higher order features, what do you mean by that?
Well, think about edges and lines.
Mm-hmm.
Individual neurons in V1 start responding to lines of specific orientations.
Okay.
Those lines often correspond to the boundaries of objects in the real world.
So V1 is already starting to make sense of shapes, not just light and dark.
Exactly. And this is just the beginning.
Okay.
As the signal travels from V1 to other visual areas, V2, V3, and so on, the processing gets even more complex.
So it's like a hierarchy of visual processing,
Right.
each level building upon the last.
Right.
But what happens next? How does the brain go from seeing lines and shapes to recognizing objects and understanding what they mean?
That's a fantastic question. And it takes us to the heart of how the brain constructs our visual reality.
Okay.
But before we delve into that, let's take a quick pause.
Sounds good. We'll be right back.
Okay.
After a short break. Welcome back. We're in the middle of uncovering how your brain transforms simple light into the rich visual world you experience. It's amazing to think how much processing is going on without you even realizing it.
It is remarkable. And as we were just discussing that, processing gets more and more sophisticated as we move deeper into the brain.
We left off talking about how V1, the primary visual cortex, starts picking out lines and edges.
Right.
What happens next? How does the brain go from those basic building blocks to recognizing actual objects?
Well, from V1, the visual information flows to other areas like V2 and V3, and the processing gets even more complex. Think of it as a hierarchy, each level extracting more abstract features from the visual scene.
So it's like those lines and edges from V1 are getting assembled into more meaningful shapes.
Exactly. As you move up this hierarchy, neurons respond to increasingly complex features, from simple lines to corners, curves, and eventually to complete shapes and objects.
That's incredible. But how does the brain know what those shapes actually represent? A circle could be a ball, a coin the sun. How does it figure that out?
That's a great question, and it takes us to a fundamental challenge. Envision the inverse problem. Imagine a small object, close-up O. It can cast the same image on your retina as a larger object further away. The brain has to figure out which interpretation is correct.
So it's not just about the pattern of light hitting the retina. The brain has to use other cues to figure out what's actually causing that pattern.
Precisely. It draws on a whole range of information. Light intensity, color, motion, depth cues. It's a bit like a detective gathering evidence to solve a case.
And this is where experience comes in, right? Our brains have learned how objects look in different situations at different distances and under different lighting conditions.
Exactly. The brain isn't just passively receiving information, it's actively interpreting that information based on past experiences and knowledge.
So our perception isn't just a reflection of the world, it's a construction, a best guess based on the available evidence and our own internal models.
That's a great way to put it. And the amazing thing is this whole process is happening constantly without any conscious effort on our part.
It's almost like we have a virtual reality simulator running inside our heads, constantly updating and refining its model of the world.
A great analogy, and this simulator isn't just about recognizing objects, it's also about understanding their relationships and predicting how they'll behave.
So it's not just what, but also where and what's going to happen next.
Yeah, exactly. The book mentions two main processing streams in the visual system, the what pathway and the where pathway.
That makes sense. One is figuring out what the object is, and the other is tracking its location and movement.
Precisely. And this information is integrated with input from other senses. And with our memory systems, we're not just seeing objects, we're drawing on a vast library of past experiences to understand their significance and predict how they might behave.
So it's all interconnected perception, memory, prediction. They're all working together to create our experience of the world. That's incredible to think about.
It is, and this interconnectedness is what allows us to go beyond simple reflexive behaviors and engage in more complex goal-directed actions. It's the foundation for planning, decision-making, and many of the hallmarks of higher-level cognition.
Speaking of higher level cognition, we touched on the neocortex earlier. It sounds like it plays a big role in all of this. Could you remind us what it is and why it's so important for vision?
Of course, the neocortex is that wrinkled outer layer of the brain. It's particularly prominent in mammals, especially in the lineage leading to humans. And it's where a lot of the sophisticated processing we've been talking about takes place.
So it's like the brain's command center integrating all that information from the senses and internal systems.
Exactly. And one of the things that makes the neocortex so powerful is its modular structure. It's built from repeating units, making it incredibly scalable. Think of it as a vast network of interconnected processors.
That's amazing. So the neocortex is essentially a supercharged version of those earlier brain regions that were just handling basic responses to the world.
That's a great way to put it. And this increased processing power is what allowed mammals and eventually humans to develop much more complex behaviors. It's the foundation for planning to the future, navigating complex social situations, and all sorts of other cognitive feats.
It's really remarkable to think how a structure like the neocortex, built from those simple repeating units, could give rise to such a vast array of cognitive abilities.
It is. And remember, we're just focusing on vision here. But the neocortex is involved in all sorts of other functions, from language to memory to abstract thought.
It's like the ultimate multitasker, juggling all these different processes and creating a seamless experience of the world.
Exactly, and it's constantly learning and adapting, refining its models based on new experiences.
Speaking of learning and adapting, we talked earlier about optical illusions. They seem like a fun way to explore how our brains can sometimes be tricked. Can you tell us a little more about how they work?
Absolutely. Optical illusions are a fascinating window into how our brains construct reality. They highlight the fact that perception isn't a passive process. It's an active interpretation shaped by our expectations and past experiences.
So instead of just faithfully recording what's out there, our brains are filling in gaps, making assumptions, and sometimes getting things a little wrong.
Precisely. Take the classic Kinesic triangle illusion. You see a white triangle that isn't really there. Your brain is wired to find patterns and complete shapes, so it fills in the missing pieces.
That's so cool. It's like our brains are adding information to the world, not just receiving it. Are there other examples like that?
There are many. Think about the Necker cube. The same image can be perceived in two different ways. Your perception flips back and forth because there isn't enough information to settle on a single interpretation.
It's like our brains are trying on different models, trying to find the best fit for the ambiguous data.
That's a great way to think about it. And even simple things like size perception can be influenced by context objects look larger at the end of a long corridor because your brain incorporates depth cues and its knowledge of perspective.
So our perception of size isn't absolute. It's relative to the surrounding environment and our understanding of how things work in the world.
Exactly. And these illusions aren't just fun party tricks. They're valuable tools for understanding how our visual system works. They reveal the hidden rules and biases that shape our perception.
It's amazing to think that something as simple as a drawing on a piece of paper can tell us so much about the inner workings of our brains. It really makes you question what objective reality even means if our perceptions are so heavily influenced by our own experiences.
That's a profound point, and it highlights the fact that we each experience the world in a unique way, shaped by our own individual history and the way our brains have learned to interpret sensory information.
It's like we're each wearing a pair of custom-made perceptual glasses, filtering and shaping the world around us.
I love that analogy, and those glasses are constantly being adjusted, refined by each new experience and interaction. It's a dynamic, ever-evolving process.
That's really beautiful when you think about it. It means we're not just passive recipients of information, we're active participants in creating our own realities.
Exactly, and this dynamic interplay between perception and experience is what makes our brains so incredibly adaptable and capable of learning and growth. It's a testament to the power of evolution to create a system that's both robust and flexible, capable of navigating the complexities of a constantly changing world.
I'm so glad we're having this conversation. It's really eye-opening, so to speak, but we've covered a lot of ground, and I want to make sure we have time to talk about those copies of action commands that the book mentions. Do you remember that part?
Absolutely. That's one of the most fascinating examples of how our brains anticipate the sensory consequences of our own actions.
It's like having an internal prediction machine constantly comparing what we expect to see with what we actually see.
Exactly. And this prediction piece system is essential for smooth, coordinated movement. Can you imagine if every time you moved your head, the entire world appeared to jump?
That would be incredibly disorienting, but our brains have evolved a way to avoid that.
Yes, by sending those copies of action commands, the visual system can essentially subtract the expected visual changes caused by our own movements. It's as if our brains are constantly editing out the self-generated visual noise.
That's mind-blowing. So our brains are not only interpreting the world, they're also actively shaping our perception of it based on our own actions.
Precisely. And this ability to distinguish self from non-self has profound implications. It suggests that to make sense of the world, an organism must include itself in its model of the world.
That's a deep thought. It implies that the very act of perceiving the world might be intertwined with the emergence of a sense of self.
It's a fascinating idea, and one that hints at the complex relationship between perception action and the development of consciousness. But I think we'll save that for another deep dive.
Yeah, we'll have to pick that up another time. But for now, I think that's a great place to wrap up this part of our exploration of vision and cognition. Welcome back to our deep dive into the evolution of senses and cognition. You've been with us on this incredible journey from basic light detection to a brain that builds models and predicts the future.
It's amazing, isn't it?
It really is.
It's mind-boggling how much our brains do behind the scenes, shaping how we experience the world.
Yeah, but the story doesn't end there.
No, it doesn't.
How did these sensory systems lead to higher level thinking?
Right.
Things like planning, decision-making, even language?
That is the million-dollar question. And you see a crucial turning point.
Okay.
Was the evolution of the telencephalon,
Okay.
a part of the forebrain that we touched upon earlier.
Right.
It evolved to integrate external sensory signals with internal states.
So, like, putting it simply, is it like figuring out if you're hungry
Yes.
and if there's food around
Yeah.
and then deciding what to do about it?
Precisely. In early chordates, the hypothalamus,
Okay.
a part of the telencephalon,
Okay.
played a big role in those basic decisions.
Okay.
But in mammals, things got more complex. The telencephalon expanded
Okay.
and evolved into the neocortex and other structures we see today.
So the neocortex, that incredible processing center we keep discussing, is actually built upon this ancient decision-making system.
Exactly. It operates on the same fundamental principles,
Okay.
integrating information and guiding actions,
Right.
but with much more power and flexibility.
Wow.
It's like going from a simple calculator to a supercomputer capable of running complex simulations.
That's a perfect analogy. This expansion must have allowed for some incredible leaps in cognitive complexity.
It did. It allowed mammals to develop more sophisticated behaviors,
Right.
from planning for the future to navigating complex social structures.
Okay.
They were no longer just reacting to the immediate environment. They were starting to shape their own destinies.
That's incredible. So the neocortex is essentially the brain's executive branch, making decisions based on information from the senses and internal systems. It's amazing how it evolved from such humble beginnings.
You're exactly right. And this executive function is crucial for goal-directed behavior.
Yeah.
It's what allows you to plan your actions, weigh different options, and make choices to achieve your goals.
It's like having a CEO in your head,
Yes.
making strategic decisions based on the best available information, but to plan for the future.
Right.
Don't we need a good memory, too?
That's a key point. You need to be able to remember past experiences, both good and bad, to make informed decisions. And the evolution of the neocortex, along with other structures like the hippocampus, allowed for the storage and retrieval of vast amounts of information.
Huh?
It's like upgrading from a simple notepad to a massive cloud storage system.
Wow, that's a huge leap. So all this processing power, the ability to integrate information and make complex decisions, that's what paved the way for even more advanced abilities like language.
Language requires you to store and retrieve a huge vocabulary.
Right.
And understand complex grammatical rules. It's a cognitive feat that builds upon those earlier developments we've been discussing.
Yeah, it's incredible to think about all the pieces that had to fall into place for language to evolve.
It is. And language, in turn, opened up a whole new world of possibilities. It allowed for the sharing of knowledge, the development of complex social structures, and the transmission of culture across generations. It's like going from a solo instrument to a full orchestra, exponentially increasing the potential for expression.
That's a beautiful way to put it. But from there, how did we go from language to the kind of abstract thought that makes us human?
Think of it this way.
Okay.
Language gives you the tools to manipulate symbols, create mental models, and reason about the world in abstract terms.
Okay.
It's like having a set of mental Lego blocks that you can use to build incredibly complex and nuanced structures.
So it's building upon all those earlier abilities, the sensory processing, the decision-making, the memory.
Yes.
And now language provides the tools to think about things that aren't directly in front of us.
Exactly. And this capacity for abstract thought is what underlies many of the unique cognitive abilities we associate with human intelligence.
Okay.
Things like scientific reasoning, artistic expression, moral judgment.
Yeah.
It all traces back to that incredible journey of evolution.
Yeah.
From simple senses to complex cognition.
It's awe-inspiring to think about the long chain of events that led to us being able to have this very conversation.
Right.
To share ideas and explore these complex topics.
Absolutely.
It all started with those humble, light-sensitive cells.
It truly is. And it all underscores the power of natural selection to shape not only our bodies, but also our minds.
Right.
It's a journey of discovery that will continue to unfold as we explore the frontiers of neuroscience.
Well, we've reached the end of this deep dive. I hope you've gained a new appreciation for the amazing journey of your senses and how it has shaped the evolution of cognition. It's a story that continues to unfold within each of us.
Until next time, keep those minds curious and those synapses